Questions we always wanted to ask God. Questions that keep people away from God. Questions that need to be addressed and need to be addressed in serious ways without simple pat answers. Questions that need to be addressed in ways that respect people's intelligence. Last week I talked about my belief that God exists. And so it's natural this week for us to take a look at this question. If God is so loving, then why does suffering exist? I believe that this is another one of those key, important questions. So today I'm trying to organize my thoughts in three areas. The first, a kind of historical, theological overview of suffering. Second, a let's get honest section. And then finally, what I believe around the issue of suffering. First, historical overview. I think it's fair to make a general observation that throughout history, suffering has generally been linked to punishment. The general belief has been that when suffering occurs, someone's at fault. In the earlier days, when a stranger arrived in a village, and if something bad happened in that village shortly after that, then it was viewed that God was punishing the village because of something the stranger had done. Someone had to be at fault. In earlier days, when someone was ill, the first response was, who's being punished here? They were not aware of medical reasons and viruses and other causes of illness. And so the response was, someone's being punished. Someone's to blame. And that was certainly true in Jesus' day. In this gospel reading, we have the story of a man who was born blind, and when Jesus came near him, his disciples said to Jesus, who's at fault here? Do we blame the man for being blind? Do we blame his parents because he was blind? Who's at fault? Jesus gave what may seem to be at first a strange answer. He said, no one's at fault here. This man was born blind so that the glory of God or the works of God could be seen. Now, you could take that on a surface and say that Jesus was saying that God made this person blind so that God could look good later on. However, I think if you get below that, there's a different message here. No one is at fault when suffering occurs in our lives and in our world. However, the way we respond to that suffering can show the goodness and the power and the healing and the reconciliation and the help and the hope that is God. God can shine through the situation depending how we respond. And even today we still hear suffering being linked to punishment. When Katrina devastated the city of New Orleans, clerics from various faiths around the world said it was because God was punishing New Orleans because of rampant homosexuality. This is the pervasive culture or context of suffering in many people's minds. That suffering happens because it's someone's fault. Either it's God's fault, God did it, or it's the universe or fate, or someone is being punished for something. And if I can accomplish anything in this sermon today, I want to shatter this myth that suffering somehow has to do with punishment. And I also want to shatter the belief that it's God's will when things happen. I do not believe that it was God's will that the Holocaust happened. And I do not believe that everything that happens in your life or the life of someone near you is God's will. Similarly, from the New Age perspective, I do not accept the belief that if something bad happens to you, you chose that, or you somehow brought that into your life. Now, to be fair, there is also historical context where abundance or good fortune is seen as a reward. It's a basic belief for some in a God of rewards and punishment, a belief that I reject. I do not believe that people who are ill are being punished, or that people who are poor are being punished by God. I do not believe that people who have great health and lots of money are somehow being rewarded by God. I do not believe that God is a God of rewards and punishment. I believe that God is a God of love and justice. Now, in this first slide, we have the story of Job. Job was a very wealthy man, big family, lots of crops. And as the story is told, God and Satan are having an argument or a discussion. And Satan is basically saying, yeah, Job's a nice guy now, but wait until the bad times come. Let me loose God and I'll prove it to you. And so Job lost his family, lost everything that he had, according to the story. And Job held on to his hope. Even his friends and family said to him, give up on this God, curse God. And Job said no. And Job held on to hope. Now the story seems to give an impression that God has allowed all of this awful stuff to happen to test Job. And again, I reject that analogy. However, I better clarify. I reject the analogy that somehow God will send terrible things into someone's life just to test them. However, I do believe that circumstances happen in our lives that do test us, that test our character, that test our will, that tests us. I do not believe that God sent the test. Job said, I will not give up hope. And in Job, we see the works of God, indeed, the glory of God. So now to slide 2 around world religions. How have different religions viewed suffering? And I want to thank Mike Thorne, who teaches our course in world religions, for giving me some of this insight. Traditional Christianity, Judaism, and Islam have either viewed suffering as a punishment for sin, or a consequence of sin, or a test sent from God. Hinduism and Buddhism tends to explain suffering in terms of desire or attachment. Hinduism also teaches that suffering is a part of the cycles of life and death, a reality that's with us. So the second area of my sermon is entitled, Let's Get Honest. You know, much of the suffering in our world is our own responsibility. And this slide will help us to illustrate that. Again, much of the suffering that exists is not God's fault, God's will. It's our own responsibility. Whether that's collectively as a society, or in some case individually. We have brought some things on ourselves. Poverty is not God's will or intention. Poverty exists in our world primarily because we do not have the will to end it. And we hold on to what we have instead of helping and sharing with those who are in need. War is not God's desire or God's fault. War is an example of the failings of humanity to be able to resolve our differences. Much of the disease that exists in our world is not God's intention or fault. Sometimes we have brought it on ourselves through lifestyle choices. Sometimes the environmental issues and what we've done to our water and our air and our food are causing diseases among us. And sometimes diseases are allowed to continue because we haven't taken action to provide the resources to those who are in need to be able to counteract it. And the best example of that is mother-to-child transmission of HIV/AIDS that we can end. It has ended in North America, and we can end it around the world if we had the will to do it. And certainly oppression is not God's will or intention. This month we focus on Black History Month and the issue of discrimination and the awful ills of discrimination that are seen throughout history are not God's intention or God's fault.